Okay, so now before we talk about this concept of anonymous functions that your book brings up first, I'm going to kind of do this in a little different order. And I want you to understand this concept of passing functions to other functions. And those other functions are called functions because they're a function that actually takes an argument of a function. So anyway, let's look at an example. Sounds fancy, but you'll get the idea. So let's say that we have some function like x squared. Here's a graph of that function. And we want to calculate something. This is just kind of a simple example. Get the idea across. We want to calculate something like, wonder what the average values are of this function of x squared, like from 0 to 10. So if you took the average of what's, x squared is 0 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 all the way up to 10, and all the values in between, you average those, what would that be? Or the average of x squared between some other range, but let's just say from 0 to 10. So we'd obviously have 0 plus 1 plus 4 plus so on and so forth, plus all the values in between. So how would we calculate that if we wanted to know that? Well, we could write some little simple program. Oh, try to get this to scroll here. There we go. We could write a little program here that's, let's just make an array of x values. So I was saying 0, 1, 2, 3, but let's make more. Let's make 100 points, something like that. So 0, 0.1, all the way up to 10. So we could do that. So we could make this array of x values, or this vector of x values, using our linear space command. And just say go from 0 to 10. So it's going to make this big array of 100 points between 0 and 10. And then we could calculate all the y values that correspond with those x values, right? So we could say y, given the function x squared, right? So we're thinking about x squared. So we could say our y array here is going to be, take the x array and square all of those values, element by element. So the dot means again, right? We apply this operator squared to every single one of the values in x. So we'd have 0 and then 0.1 squared and 0.2 squared and so on and so forth. So all the y values would be stored here. And then we could get the average of all of those y values by using our little built-in mean function here. So the average of all the y values, store that in some variable like result. Okay, that would give us the average of all the values of x squared between 0 and 10. At least all the values if we space them out 100 points between 0 and 10. Okay, so that makes sense. That has nothing to do with functions yet. So let's think now, well, what if we decided later that we wanted to calculate the average of some other function between some other range? So maybe we've got some other function here. I'm just going to pick a simple one again, cubed. And we want to calculate the function, the average of all the values of x cubed between 5 and 20. Okay, something like that, whatever those were. And we want to get the average of all the values along that function. Well, we could go back and we could write another program or another set of commands like this. So we could say x equals linspace 5 to 20. Okay, so we rewrite that. So x equals linspace 5 to 20. And then we could say y equals x cubed dot caret 3. And then we could say result equals mean of y. So we could write all three of these lines again, slightly different, and we'd get our value. And then maybe later on we want to do this again with another function. So we've got some other function like sine. And it goes 0 here, it goes like this. And we want to calculate all the average values of sine between some range and another. Well, we could do the same thing again. We could write this line, this line, this line. This time it would be linear space between whatever this is, and then this would be sine of x, and then mean of y. Okay, so we could write all three of those lines again. We could do these three lines over and over and over again for lots of different functions. But whenever you start seeing something like this, where you're repeating things, this is where you've already learned a little bit in previous programming classes. This is where maybe there's some way to generalize this. And if we're going to do something over and over again in a very similar way, maybe we could do something similar to like how we made a method in the past. You'd make methods or functions, okay, so you don't have to repeat things over and over again. Well, we could do the same thing here. We could actually do something like this. we could write a new function. I call it something like function average, because that's what we're doing, is we're doing an average between a range. We call it whatever we want. But that function is, the whole point of it is to do what we just did, calculate the average of some points of a function between two starting and ending points. But this function will take another function as an argument. So what this function is this function called function average that we're calling it. And it takes as an argument some other function like x squared or x cubed or whatever gets passed in. And the starting and ending values like 0 to 10, 5 to 20 or whatever they are. And it calculates what we just did, but we can reuse this over and over again and pass in whichever function we want. So we've got our same exact things here that we did up above, except now they're general. They're allowing us to pass in various starting and ending points like 0 and 10, or 5 and 20, or whatever you want to call it. Okay, and then here's the key thing. When I say f of x here, what this f is the function f that gets passed in. So we're passing in a handle to some function like x squared or x cubed or sine or something like that. And when we call f of x here, we're calling whatever that function is. And then we calculate our result. So let's jump over to MATLAB and see this in action. Hopefully this makes a little more sense. So here's that func average method. Okay, so it takes in some argument f, which is a function. It's two starting and stopping values, and then it calculates what we just did. This is basically what I just wrote, except instead of saying x and y, I called it x array and y array. So f here is going to be whatever gets passed in. So let's try this. So I've actually created another function called square. Here's another M file I've created. And this is just a super simple function. I call it square, and all it does is square a value. Okay, there's our x squared. So I could do that original, jump back here for a second, the original thing that we talked about. If I get this to come back down, x squared from 0 to 10. I could do this by doing the following. If I say, let's see, func average, okay, jump over here again. That's our function here. And I'm going to call func average on square from 0 to 10. Okay, so this is very close. So watch what happens. Okay, it's going to give me a little bit of an error message. And that error message is because I'm trying to pass in something here that's not really an argument. Square is the name of a function. What we really need is a handle to that function that we can pass in. So getting back to why would we ever want to create one of these handles to a function? Because those are things that we can pass around. Handles are variables, essentially, that we can pass around to other functions. And it may sound strange, but just kind of take it for what it's worth right now. You can pass around one of these handles to a function to another function, okay? So I can do something like this. If I want to fix what I just did, I could say SQ equals at square. Now SQ is this variable that has a handle to the square function. Now I can pass that to that func average. So let's pass SQ. So what I'm doing is in func average, go back up here, I'm passing in my handle to the square function. That goes into F. I'm passing 0 and 10 to start and stop. So this is going to create a bunch of x values between 0 and 10. And then this is going to calculate a bunch of y values, corresponding y values, using the square function that I just passed in on those x values. So when I do this and hit enter, now it works. And so what it did is it added up the square of these 100 values between 0 and 10. And then it calculated the average of those. Okay? So that's what this function handle, that's where it becomes useful, is you can pass it around like it's a variable. You can pass it to other functions as an argument. It becomes a parameter in those functions. The other thing I could do, I wouldn't have had to create this handle. What I can do is just kind of pass the handle by itself, or create my own handle on the fly. Do something like this. Okay, so at square, that is a handle to the square function. So do the exact same thing. Okay, this is basically saying this is passing this handle to the square function to func_average. When I hit enter here, that should get the same answer. Okay, so we've got the average value of x squared between 0 and 10, and we did that using this func_average. And the nice thing about that is, again, now we got func_average, and it will work for any function for any range of values. So I can do x cubed or sine or anything I want, and I can pass that in and get a range of values. So we'll talk about that